This week to be closer to China. It's the 2019 political season. The annual meetings of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, CPPCC, and the National People's Congress, NPC. Given the slowing economy and an increasingly complex external environment, China's economic transformation is encountering great challenges.
China is a transition economy, and China is also a middle-income country. So certainly China has many areas to improve, but China managed to, overcome the problem and then maintain the growth momentum in the past. And I'm confident China will also be able to do that in this year and the coming years.
There are a lot of controversies about the reliability of the numbers, and there are scholars doing analysis looking at the reliability of the numbers.
How severe are China's challenges now and ahead? How to balance stimulating a weakening economy with preventing major risks?
I do think the government's, made a good decision, recognizing that there were a lot of financial risks accumulating from the extensive, a lot of credit growth, and that it was wise to begin a deleveraging process.
At the same time, China aims to open up further, to improve its business environment, and to enhance its global competitiveness. What are opportunities for international investors? This week, forecast China's economy to be closer to China. "2018 was hard for China, and 2019 may be harder still. China's economic growth slowed, and its external environment grew complicated and challenging, causing new downward economic pressures. For 2019, China is forecasting GDP growth of between 6 and 6.5%. And for the world's second largest economy, at over $13 trillion, that means absolute growth of roughly an additional $800 billion, which itself would be in the top 20 countries of the world. Why then do Chinese leaders express such concern? As Premier Li Keqiang stated in the annual government work report at the opening meeting of the 13th National People's Congress, this year China faces weighty tasks, many challenges, and high demands. Such blunt talk gets my attention. Something is going on. To forestall major risks now tops China's agenda. And as Beijing determines to stabilize growth and advance high-quality development, what are the challenges and the sensitivities? How to balance the need to stimulate a weakening economy with the need to cut debt and reduce financial risk. At the same time, China aims to expand domestic opening up and pursue international markets. All in, it's a tall task, taking us closer to China.
继续创新和完善宏观调控，确保经济运行在合理区间，深化增值税改革，将制造业等行业现行16%的税率降至13%。
For the Chinese government, the #1 task in 2019 is to support market entities, especially small and micro businesses, and the primary mechanism to do so is tax cuts and fee reductions. Tax cuts include general reductions for all companies and targeted structural abatements for specific categories: manufacturing, transportation, and construction. The primary vehicle the Chinese government is using to stimulate the economy is a reduction in VAT taxes, in some cases from 16% to 13% for manufacturing and some other industries. So give me the background of it, why the VAT tax is being used, what's the significance of the 16 to 13% reduction?
China is currently a big manufacturing power instead of a strong one. To make the shift at the current stage, the priority is to boost confidence in manufacturing, which will require some supporting policies and measures. The significant tax and fee cuts have in fact bolstered the manufacturing sector. Meanwhile, such policies enable better projections. Why? Because tax and fee cuts are stable, predictable, and long-term. Thus, manufacturers will have better long-term planning on research and development, investment, and innovation.
In addition, the plan is to reduce the social insurance contribution of enterprises by nearly 2 trillion RMB, about $300 billion US dollars, as part of the broader strategy to ensure fiscal sustainability, stable economic growth, high employment, and structural adjustment. Given the Chinese government target of putting 2 trillion RMB back into the hands of companies, small and medium-sized enterprises, manufacturing enterprises, what are the major components of that? Where do you get the 2 trillion from? We understand that roughly 800 billion will come from reduction in VAT taxes to manufacturing, but what's the total the components that make up this 2 trillion?
The expected scale of the tax and fee cuts is around 2 trillion yuan, while the real number may be even higher. To achieve the tax and fee reduction target of roughly 2 trillion yuan, we must work on both sides of the equation. For taxes, the value-added tax rate will be lowered from 16% to 13%, a reduction of 3 percentage points. Rates for the transportation and construction sectors will be cut 1 percentage point, from 10% to 9%. Finally, the whole manufacturing sector, including research and development expenditures, will also enjoy favorable tax policies. These are all policies for reducing taxes. When it comes to cutting fees, we are looking at lowering the contribution ratio for Social Security and basic pensions.
The government's targeting 2 trillion RMB to inject back into the economy, small and medium-sized companies, manufacturing companies. But that obviously means 2 trillion RMB is less coming into the government. So how do you deal with that? Is there going to be an increase in government deficit? I've heard that state-owned enterprises, SOEs, will have to dividend more of its profits.
Obviously, tax cuts will reduce China's fiscal revenue and put pressure on government finances. So how can we deal with this pressure? The first way is to moderately increase the deficit rate, to expand the deficit. This year, 380 billion was added to the deficit. The second way is to let state-owned enterprises and the banks pay some moderate taxes on their own profits. Third is to compress some general expenditures onto the existing ones, like the 3 public funds and government consumption. These are all ways to release the pressure brought about by the tax reductions. Of course, there are some other measures, like the implementation of budget performance management to make sure governments spend their money effectively. We call it doing more with less, which is the equivalent to saving money. Therefore, this comprehensive implementation of budget performance management will also help to cope with the increase of financial pressure. So the government will be called on to tighten its belt. Facing this new situation of fiscal reduction, where the necessary expenditures, especially social expenditures, cannot be reduced, the government must calculate carefully and cannot totally rely on spending money.
Moreover, to energize market entities effectively and to enhance a business-friendly environment, the government will cut red tape, cut business-related charges, and promote fair competition. At the opening meeting of this year's National People's Congress, Premier Li Keqiang declared that China has achieved its economic objectives in 2018, but with tough challenges ahead in 2019, to reach China's long-championed goal of building a moderately prosperous society in all respects by 2020. Looking ahead to 2019, what do you see about the Chinese economy?
Well, China is a transition economy, and China is also a middle-income country. So certainly China has many areas to improve. And so if you see some problem in China, certainly by nature, China has some area to improve. That means there are some area that are not as good as expected. And so, that's part of the life. But China managed to, overcome the problem and then maintain the growth momentum in the past. And I'm confident China will also be able to do that in this year and the coming years.
The economy is slowing. I met with a lot of companies during my recent trip. Their profitability has been hit badly. The automotive sector is really, the growth is not slowing. The sector is contracting. And that's going to have a real effect on the Chinese economy.
The artificial, hopes of 40 to 50 million cars a year was never realistic.
And it was never good for the environment.
It was certainly not very good for the environment, but even economically. I heard this from multinational local CEOs saying that these were their projections. And, I'm not an expert in the auto industry, but it just seemed impossible.
Again, in the bullish times, people are overly bullish, and in the bearish times, they're overly bearish. So the cyclicality in that. But again, after 40 years, I've been through a lot of cycles, and I have confidence that it'll come back. The Chinese economic leadership has, in my 40 years of experience, been pretty good at figuring out what's best for the economy.
I think the slowdown of the Chinese economy over the last year was basically because of the deleveraging has been going on too fast.
Oh.
Deleveraging has been good. The direction is right. But to the extent, the speed have been too dramatic. That have almost dried up the economy, right? So that's the prime reason why the economy is slowing down. Because if you compare 2018 and 2017, 2017 was so good, right? But suddenly in 2018 the economy slowed down substantially. This is just basically because deleveraging has been too drastic.
It's not the result of deleveraging. I do think the government's, made a good decision recognizing that there were a lot of financial risks accumulating from the extensive, a lot of credit growth, and that it was wise to begin a deleveraging process. I think they clearly understood that if they went too fast, there were risks. If they went too slow, there were risks. So they're trying to balance. And I think one of the things that happened was not just slowing down the growth of credit, but rechanneling it in the better regulated sectors into the banking system instead of shadow banking.
So if we go back 2 or 3 years, the primary economic driver was supply-side structural reform, dealing with overcapacity, deleveraging. Now there's a concern about if you deleverage too much, you're going to affect the economy at a time when the economy is weakening. So how do you deal with that tension?
So very true. So the policy need to be contingent. In the past 2 or 3 years, as you mentioned, to mitigate or to avoid the systematic risk, and especially in the financial sectors, was the main target. And now with the deleveraging has reached its goal, especially in the state-owned sectors. And so the government's policies will shift a little bit. Now change it to stabilize the leverage, and that will give the room for the monetary policy and to increase money supply, and also the credit availability to the private sectors. And that can support their investment, their industrial upgrading, and also will be a main driver of growth in China.
Alertness to danger optimizes safety. China admits that its ongoing economic transformation is facing severe challenges. At this year's 2 sessions political meetings, China pledged to deepen reform in key sectors, vowing to make big improvements in the development environment for the private sector and to adjust fiscal, taxation, regulatory, banking, and financial system policies to unlock market dynamism. The government work report called for quickening state-owned enterprise SOE reform, although it did not offer specific policies. SOE issues that need to be resolved include regulation of state assets, construction of state capital investment and management companies, adoption of mixed ownership, and modern corporate governance structures and controls. However, continuing to pursue SOE supply-side structural reform was labeled our main task. The top of the list is usually state-owned enterprises. This is something that you focused on, the new structural economy, and really would like to get your sense of the optimal, ideal kind of reforms that state-owned enterprises should go through.
I think the most important reform is to create level playing fields for all types of enterprises, because the state-owned enterprises in China, I put them into 3 categories. The first one is in the national defense-related sectors, and very capital intensive, need to be subsidized. And that's the case in any country.
Every country.
And the second one is in the natural monopoly. And in the natural monopoly sectors, the important thing is how to, monitor land and avoid the enterprises to use monopoly position to attract huge monopoly rent. And actually, the state-owned sector will be easier to discipline than the private sectors, because private sector will have high incentive for capture larger rent.
Right.
And the third one is in the competitive sectors. And the state-owned enterprises are large, and certainly the way that to overcome the potential of moral hazard is to have a competitive, level playing fields, and so the performance of the firm will be a reflection of how good they manage the firms. So I think the more important thing is to have a level playing field, and that should be the direction of China's state-owned enterprises reform.
You have focused on the state-owned sector as a critical part of the Chinese economy. What has been the status in the past? Where are we today?
Well, the major development over the last decade is the productivity of state companies has declined, and not by a small margin, but quite dramatically. Roughly 2/3 in the case of manufacturing and industrial companies. So these companies are absorbing more and more resources and producing less and less output. I think that's one of the main reasons China's economy has slowed down over the last 5 or 6 years. If their productivity had continued to match that of private companies, which it did before the global financial crisis, over recent years, China would have been growing 2 percentage points faster than it actually has. So my view is that the state companies are a big drag on China's economic growth, and they need a much more aggressive reform program to turn that around.
What are some of the current obstacles or challenges? You say that China, like any country, has its issues and problems, and as a developing countries, maybe more so, as the country is in this transitional phase.
China, during the transition process, adopted a gradual dual-track approach. On the one hand, retains many government intervention in the financial sectors, in the management of the economy, and those areas need to be improved. And also, as a growing economy, certainly you can expect some kind of structural problems. Some areas we have excess capacity. Some areas we have a huge stock. And also the companies, both the state and the private sectors, they have some kind of high leverage. And certainly China need to improve all those fronts. And on the other hand, the government also, has all kind of red tapes, and we need to simplify. We need to make business easier. And certainly, China also need to upgrade our industries and continue to improve our productivities. Those are the areas that China need to work on. And sometimes, with intention to improve that, will have some side effects. For example, if you want to have deleverage, then you cause the credit to be tight and raise, the interest rate to the business communities. At the same time, you want to reduce the excess capacity. That means you cut down the production, and you will raise the prices, and causing the cost of operation of investment to increase.
Apparently, Americans treat the public sector and the private sector the same way. And I think we should make a differentiation. You may want to resist doing business with the public sector, like the state-owned enterprises, SOE, but don't treat the private sector the same way.
What is really most important is not these short-term cyclical factors. The most important challenge the Chinese economy is facing today is the so-called middle-income trap challenge, which really means that we have built a lot of old industries based on low-cost advantages. And so these garments, toys, and so on. But the cost is risen so much, and most of the industries already lost the competitiveness. What we're facing today is really the challenge of building a set of new industries and services that would still be competitive on the high cost basis. That is happening, but we're not done yet.
For China to realize high-quality domestic development, China is committed to liberalizing and facilitating trade and investment, which means new policies to attract foreign investment, like relaxing controls over market access and shortening negative lists for foreign investors. Similarly, China is committed to globalization and free trade and endeavors to ensure its outbound investments are successful and its international cooperation harmonious. In this context, the Belt and Road Initiative, building infrastructure in developing countries, has been incorporated into China's constitution and will be pursued under the principle of achieving shared growth through discussion and collaboration. What are some categories for the future for opening markets that you would go from categories, industry sectors that were not on the positive list and have been currently on the negative list to be taken off the negative list, so that foreign companies can enter those markets? Right.
I think that in the high-tech sectors, in the service sectors, and like in telecommunication, financial services, in the insurance, and also in the more advanced industrial sectors.
So that's very broad.
Yeah.
If you were with a group of CEOs of foreign companies that are considering whether they should invest in China or other places, what would be your pitch to participate in the opportunities? What kind of opportunities do you see for the future that would be attractive to multinational corporations?
China is going to have the largest number of middle-income class, and it's a huge market opportunities. Not only in terms of the magnitude, but also in terms of the growth rate. And so in that sense, to have a strong foothold in China will be a very important way to really, grow with, the growth of China.
Then you look at the last 40 years, what global opportunities China provided during that 40 years. I would summarize into two global stories. One was the exports of labor-intensive manufacturing products. The low labor cost shifted products everywhere, and China once dominated that international market. That is gradually fading away. The second the global story was the global commodities market. When China's investment was booming significantly, China imported so much commodities. I mean, the iron ore from Australia, the price was just skyrocketing. And that was a big global story. That story is also gradually weakening. And China is still a big buyer of commodities, but I think in relative terms it would come down. Now the question is, what could be the next global story? My own prediction is the consumer goods market. When 1.4 billion people start to spend more on their consumption, that is a long-term, a very big story. And even if the economic growth slows, consumer spending could still accelerate because household income as a share of national income is still on the rise. And so more income will be spent on the consumer goods. That, I think, is a market that everybody should look at very seriously.
BRI is also deeply misunderstood, and it's an attempt to create economic development in a lot of countries which remain poor. And that, again, we should find ways to cooperate with the Chinese on.
And criticisms of the Belt and Road talk about excessive debt or corruption. I mean, anytime you do something innovative, you always have problems and always have issues. China has a long history of experimenting, seeing what's wrong, changing it, and then moving it forward.
You know, a lot of the criticisms of China as providing excessive debt and corruption, when you dig down on those, they're not really true. Even our national security advisor made statements about China's action in Africa, which turns out not to be true.
It's true in some cases. I mean,
it's true in some cases, and in some cases it's not.
Right. But it's not part of China's policy.
No, and it's excessive. In other words, the criticism is disproportionate to what's going on. On a per capita basis, China is still relatively poor. It should be able to converge towards levels of per capita income of OECD-type economies. This is the whole idea of convergence. But convergence is not automatic. I think convergence is about potential. My view about the Chinese economy long-term is if they go back onto a more strongly market-oriented reform program, they should be able to grow at about 8% per year for at least another decade, possibly two.
That's enormous.
In the short term, this transition back to more market-oriented reform could have a few bumps. You have to downsize some of these state companies. You could have a bit of a slowdown for a transition period. But I think the potential is there.
Forecasting China's economy in 2019 requires addressing three key questions. The first is the natural tension between, on the one hand, stimulating a slowing economy by easing credit and funding infrastructure, and, on the other hand, reducing financial risk by cutting debt and deleveraging. China is skewing, at least for the moment, toward more stimulus through reductions in taxes and fees, though nothing like the huge stimulus during the 2008 financial crisis. The second question is external pressures and uncertainties, such as trade frictions with the U.S. and other countries, which encourage China to stimulate domestic consumption and develop a stronger home market. The third question is how to stabilize the economy, employment, finance, trade, investment, and market expectations. While standards of living of Chinese people have risen further and faster than any comparable group in history, their expectations have risen further and faster still. Reform is essential, including opening up markets to private and foreign companies to enhance competition, and shrinking negative lists to facilitate new businesses. Under President Xi Jinping, the CPC, as China's ruling party, can address these questions optimally, balancing long-term consequences with short-term pressures. Personally, I do not put so much stock in raw GDP growth rates. One must look at its components, such as investments in infrastructure, and ask, are they productive? Critically, China has made an avowed commitment to open up further. We track China's implementation to be closer to China.